In 1914, the greatest conflict the world had ever known erupted across the European continent, and millions were killed in brutal trench warfare. Territorial gains were measured in yards as lines became ever more static and impenetrable. As militaries adapted to the new realities of warfare, it was expected that future conflicts would be similar, leading to many nations repairing fortifications and emplacements like the famous French Maginot Line.
The armies found themselves confronting these new weapon systems, but they didn't learn the lesson. And the result was that in 1914, when the armies marched off to war, they did so in the expectation that everything would be as it had been before.
But with the outbreak of World War II, a new doctrine took Europe by storm. This new style of warfare was called the Blitzkrieg. Massive sweeping advances were made by the feared panzer tanks, backed up by mechanized mobile infantry. Known for its incredible speed, it famously caused the capitulation of Poland in only a few weeks. This would only be the first of many successes of this style of warfare, which continues to influence military strategies to this day. Guderian was born on June 7, 1888 in Culm, Prussia to an aristocratic line. Guderian attended the Principal Cadet School in Berlin. He was an ambitious and charming student, but determined and serious-minded as well. Then in 1907, Guderian joined the 10th Light Infantry Battalion, commanded by his father, a colonel. Under his tutelage, he learned a great deal, but also participated in leisure activities with the troops. A stern leader, Guderian was both revered and feared by his troops. Guderian transferred to the 3rd Telegraph Battalion in 1912, expanding his knowledge of radio communications. Over the next decade, Guderian immersed himself in new technologies that were rapidly being introduced in the military, which would prove invaluable to all future wars. Guderian's work as a specialist paid off when he was chosen as the youngest among 168 officers who attended the War Academy in Berlin. Guderian, developing a reputation for his rapid, decisive actions, earned the nickname Schneller Heinz, or Quick Heinz. Guderian's intensive study of military tactics was interrupted at the start of the Great War. Guderian joined the communications staff, putting his skills to use for the first time in a combat situation. Guderian continued to accumulate combat experience even after the war, fighting various uprisings during the turmoil that followed the armistice. After the end of the troubles in post-war Germany, Guderian returned to his studies of military tactics, now focusing on mechanized warfare. During the interwar period, Guderian collected vast amounts of information on tanks and began theorizing strategies that would soon be employed in World War II. However, Guderian's ideas regarding mechanized forces were not focused solely on tanks, but advocated a combined arms force, with all branches working cooperatively in a manner that many future armies would try to emulate. Particularly important was air support, making up for the lesser firepower of the early panzers with dive bombers and strafing runs. Additionally, motorized infantry was used to rapidly consolidate the advances made by the armor. With his background in wireless communications, Guderian realized the importance of radio for communication between units as they moved rapidly into enemy territory, and pushed for them to be included in the newly built panzers. His forward-thinking attitude is exemplified in his writings, stating, "New weapons call for new ways of fighting, and for the appropriate tactical and organizational forms." The integration of new technologies into his doctrine was a critical element of what put Guderian above many of his contemporaries. Guderian's ambitions truly began to pay off as he was appointed Chief of Staff of the Motorized Troops. He quickly began implementing his new doctrine Blitzkrieg, meaning lightning war, which manifested Guderian's rapid mode of warfare. In 1937, Guderian published his book Achtung Panzer, catching the attention of Hitler, who took great interest in up-and-coming young officers. The book was a codification of everything Guderian had studied for in the past decades and put forth his theories on motorized warfare. The armed forces of Germany, and even many post-war nations, would be organized largely along the lines laid out by this work. By the outbreak of war in 1939, Guderian had become leader of the 19th Corps, consisting of one panzer division and two motorized infantry divisions. He put his theories into practice, utterly dominating the outdated Polish forces, which had previously been thought to be quite strong by contemporaries. Poland capitulated in barely over a month. In 1940, Guderian led another assault into France, a formidable military power which for decades had been developing its defenses along the border in anticipation of another great war. However, this proved to be for naught as Guderian led his corps through the undefended Ardennes forest and over the Meuse River in only 3 days. Ignoring orders from his superiors, he audaciously penetrated behind the lines, resulting in the encirclement and destruction of the French army.
More famously, the French campaign of 1940, that Guderian was able to make use of the ideas that he'd long been bringing to fruition.
Despite such incredible victories, the war was far from over. Upon finding out about Hitler's plans to invade Russia, Guderian was furious, going so far as to openly question the Nazi leader's plans. Nevertheless, Guderian eventually acquiesced and led one of his 4 Eastern Panzer Corps into Russia. Applying his tactics on a grand scale, his push into Russia was brutally effective.
Well, the key takeaway from the experiences of World War II, especially the war on the Eastern Front, where Guderian's concepts were given their freest rein, at least initially, was that surprise and constant movement were the keys to victory. The enemy who allowed himself to be surprised, the enemy who counted on a static defense, was an enemy who was simply setting himself up for defeat by highly mobile forces which could pick and choose their place and moment of attack.
Guderian won crucial victories at Minsk and Smolensk and carried the battle to within 200 miles of Moscow. In a single week, the Red Army lost hundreds of tanks, most of their air force, and 600,000 soldiers. German efforts in Russia soon fell apart. Political wrangling among German military leaders and ineffective supply lines caused dissent and chaos. Guderian's arguments with the few were intensified. After a campaign in the south to capture the Caucasian oil fields, where Guderian played a major role in the victory of Kiev, he turned north once again, and with weary soldiers and worn-out vehicles, he joined the delayed drive towards Moscow. Guderian's most explicit defiance occurred when he defied Hitler's order to stand fast during the harsh Russian winter, beginning a gradual retreat to safer positions. Guderian's bravado and contrarianism having once famously said, "It is sometimes tougher to fight my superiors than the French," eventually cost him his position in the army. Along with many other successful but confrontational commanders, Hitler forced Guderian to retire. Although German prospects for a rapid victory waned, they were able to repel Allied offensives in the winter of 1941 and into early 1942, though with considerable difficulty. Searching for someone to bring order to the German war effort, military leaders convinced Hitler that Guderian was needed. Hitler agreed and recalled Guderian to be Inspector General of the Panzer Forces in 1943, but even he could not reverse the turning tides of the war. Soon the general was back in the middle of Nazi political and military infighting, including disputes with Hitler. Desperation began to take hold in Germany as the inexorable Russian war machine began to push back and the North African front fell to the British. As the Allies advanced further, Guderian was even reinstated to command the Eastern Front. However, there was little the shattered German army could do but fall back to the fatherland. With the D-Day landings in France, a third front was open, heralding the final stand of the Third Reich. On April 30th, 1945, Berlin was captured. The Second World War was over. As the guns fell silent across Europe, many Nazi leaders were put on trial for various war crimes and atrocities. No charges, however, were brought against Guderian despite the Russians wanting to punish him. His conduct was found to be entirely respectable and he cannot truly be seen as a real Nazi, serving as a matter of patriotism rather than fascist principle. He was even allowed to continue service in the military after the restructuring of Germany, shaping the newly formed Bundeswehr. Although Guderian's highly developed tactics could not win the war for the Germans, his tanks had rampaged across the face of Europe, and left behind in the muddy tracks was the model of warfare that would be used in the coming decades. His impact on war is clearly seen even today. The role of tanks to push the advanced and motorized infantry to hold gains is still a core principle of warfare.
It calls for the use of overwhelming power at carefully selected points, the use of spectacular displays of force, and superior intelligence about the enemy, so as to paralyze the will of the enemy and to destroy its ability to fight.
The first Gulf War was won in a matter of days through rapid armored thrusts covered by intense close air support, mirroring the early German campaigns in Poland and France. Despite huge advantages in weapon systems, Guderian's theories continued to apply to modern warfare, as he himself once said, "Whenever in future wars the battle is fought, armored troops will play the decisive role."